Or if you would, turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Chapter 7, this is the last time in chapter 7. We're going to be rolling today. I know, we're going to be verses 25 through 40.
Whoa.
That's a big chunk for us. Grand plan, so be prepared to have a late lunch. We'll see how this goes today. It should go fairly quickly. We've laid the theme for this chapter for a while now. We've been digging into it. We've laid out all the basic understanding. So looking at Paul's last thoughts on this really shouldn't be too hard for us to do to get through this. Because Paul is going to go back here. If you remember our setting here, Paul is answering questions. You can see that there in verse 1 of chapter 7 where we started this quite some time ago. Now for the matters you wrote me about. Remember that? Paul has received a letter. We often forget when we think about the church at Corinth that there was a core of people there that wanted to do the right thing. We always think of Corinth as being a church that had nothing but problems. If you could go wrong, if you could have a sin of any kind, you could find it at Corinth. There's no denying that. But we forget that while this was going on, there was a group of people, there were believers in Corinth that were looking and saying, we want to do what's right before God. We really do want to get this right, and we're not sure how. And as we said, they were struggling. They were struggling in two big areas. One was the surrounding culture. We said it was a perverse culture. It was a highly sexualized culture, which should certainly strike us now in our current times and make it very relevant to us as we think about this. We just came out of Pride Month, and I don't know if you watched some of the events that were put out for Pride Month, but it was certainly some of the most outlandish and over-the-top sexuality you could ever imagine. This was their daily lives. They lived in that kind of culture where everything was right in front of you, like it is for us. This past week, a major corporation in America has said that they're going to have name badges for all of their employees that will include their preferred pronouns right there. As I said, somehow or other, we've come to a point in our culture with you when your sexuality is the first and most important thing I need to know about you. That somehow that's the critical thing that drives our lives. Well, this is what was happening here. And so they had come to this point where they were looking at that problem, and the problem was that it had come into the church. The church, by and large, was struggling with this. A large segment of the church had decided that they were buying into the culture, that the way to be understanding and caring was to live the same way as the surrounding culture. So you have this group that says, what do we do to hold the line? How do we get this right? How do we get that? And they had two pushing forces coming at them. One group was the Jewish contingent. Remember their teaching? What did the Jews tell? Here's the answer to a highly sexualized culture. Here's what you must do to follow what God said.
No sex.
You have to be married. You have to be married. That's the Jewish. We'll get to the other one. Hold on to that answer. You'll be right in just a minute. The Jewish side said this. You have to get married. God commanded marriage. An unmarried man and an unmarried woman at a certain age is a sin. They flat out said that. Here was the other thing. And you had to have children. And if you couldn't have children, if something was going on there, clearly you must be under judgment by God because this is what God wants, and there must be some sin in your life. They didn't recognize any kind of physical limitations, any kind of thing. That was what they taught. Now against that came this other movement. And this other movement taught,
No sex.
there you go. We're going to get past this problem in the culture, this sexuality, and we're just going to shut the whole thing down. And we're going to say this, if you're not married, don't get married. We're just going to do that. We're going to take vows of chastity. We're going to decide to push it up. If you are married, you're going to elevate that marriage to a higher level by doing away with sensuality. It will just be two people living together as friends in a situation. And this is how we're going to deal with that situation. If we want to go further, to keep perversion out of our lives, to keep corruption out of our lives, if you've been saved and your spouse isn't, what are we going to do now?
Divorce.
We'll get rid of that spouse. We'll send them packing because we are going to be pure as a people. This is where Paul has to start. Now, Paul starts in verse 1 of chapter 7 and makes a very interesting statement. It is good for a man not to marry. Now, he makes that statement and never explains it until the last part of the chapter. Because the first thing he does is, those of you that say we just ban marriage, there is a room for that. God actually does gift some people to be single. But Paul's next statement makes it very plain, not that many. There are some that God has blessed with the ability to remain single and pure, but since there is so much immorality, instead of your answer, we'll ban marriage, here's what my answer: each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. And he goes on and says they should fill their marriage responsibility to each other. In other words, guess what? Here's the solution. I want you to understand. The world always has this solution to a problem. Any institution I see, I look at anything that's out there and I find a problem with it. Marriage. I find marriage is a problem. There's a problem. So what's the world's answer when we find problems in marriage? Then we find there's abuse. Some husbands are abusive, right?
Let's get rid of all.
Well, just get rid of marriage. Obviously, it's evil. There's problems with it. Look what some men do to their children. Look at the sexual predators. Look at all the problems. Let's look at the problems with this, and here's our solution. We'll tear it down. Now, the next question is, and replace it with what? If you're going to get rid of it, if you found all these problems with it, what are you going to do after you get through tearing it down? And there's the problem. The world doesn't have an answer to the second question. Yeah, John?
Well, it's blaming the institution or the thing rather than the people where the sin and evil lies. You know, it's the same thing with the gun shootings, you know, that they'll have. It's well, okay, we're gonna pass gun laws, we're gonna, you know, the guns that are the problem. No, it's people that are the problem, you know, in which the evil and wickedness lies. And that's what we need to change and deal with.
It's no different than the abortion thing here. That's a baby's a problem. Okay, get rid of the babies. Instead of the sin.
This has become a shift if we look at the abortion debate right now that they're talking about. Women cannot be equal until they are free from the burden of childbearing. I want you to understand that we're no longer talking about whether there's rape and incest and those kinds of things that should there be exceptions about that or not. They've moved way beyond that debate. The whole thing now is it holds women back from total freedom. And therefore, if it's an impediment to that, what do? We get rid of it. That's our solution. And Paul's beginning point is this. When you find a problem, the solution is not get rid of everything. The solution is fix the issue as it exists. And his first thing is, it's not that marriage is the problem, it's the way that people are treating marriage is the problem. Here's what we need to do. The first thing the church has to have is a high view of marriage, the view that God always had. You have to view marriage in a way that God viewed marriage. You have to live marriage in the way that God said marriage was supposed to be. So he talks about the responsibilities of this, and he gets very serious about it. We could have spent a lot more time on this, because there are a ton of things to understand about this, to talking about marriage. But God's saying, through Paul here, the first solution is to put marriage back where it belongs. To have the kind of marriages God intended. There's a whole series of things. Just to revamp what we've covered in the last few weeks, to put this out. Are there problems in marriage?
Yes.
Are there abuses?
Yes.
Is it true that most predators on children are actually family members and people who know the children?
Yes.
That is. We know these things are true. But what is the best solution? Paul comes back to this. Here's this one. Toxic masculinity is something we talk about today a lot, right? Do you think there's some toxicity and masculinity in the world?
Yes.
Sure there is. Like what? Give me an example. What do you see where guys are clearly a problem?
Oh, chauvinistic attitudes.
There's one. Are there some men that treat women like dirt? Boy, I guess. What else?
Well, the pornography industry is fueled mostly by men.
There you go. They have a problem with that. Sexuality, they view women as objects. There's a problem with men, yes.
Men that use violence to get what they want.
There it is. Men are aggressive. Guess what? That's true. On average, men are more aggressive than women. And we have labeled that toxic. And what's our solution to deal with it?
Get rid of men.
Masculinity in them.
We'll just ruin masculinity. We'll label that a problem and say it has to be done away with. God has a little different approach to that. One of my favorite books, and I'll recommend this one to you, is by George Gilder. It's called Men in Marriage. This is not necessarily a Christian book, but it has an interesting view. He tells the story of a barbarian who meets a woman and becomes civilized. And he says, this is the picture of marriage. He says, you have this problem. Here's your reality in culture. Men are going to be more aggressive than women. You have two options. One, let men be aggressive and control society through their aggression. And he says you can do that through gangs, through violence, through wars. You can do that. Or try this one. You can put men into marriage where you channel that aggression into productive things as leaders, as fathers, as husbands, to do positive things. He said this, relationships teach men compassion, temperance, and it curbs their violence into a productive structure where good things happen. And I thought, you know what? He's right. God made us different. I know that's not in our culture to accept. God made us different. And men were different in this regard. They tend to be more aggressive, and you can either let that turn into sin or productivity. Yes.
The other side is that you could watch a child grow, a young man that's tender-hearted, and if they don't have the right guidance from parents, they could be ridiculed into thinking they're weak because they're tender-hearted,
Yes.
and that ruins them too.
It certainly can. Because men need to be tenderhearted. There needs to be a gentility. There needs to be that balance that has to be found. And again, instead of finding the balance, we either push the thing to one extreme or the other.
Right.
Where we take the masculinity out, or we put it into a thing where there's no compassion. I'll tell you something. As a guy that grew up in a very violent family, I was not one who tended to like to hug anybody. You get inside my zone, and that I am incredibly uncomfortable. Because that's a very vulnerable thing. I don't like people in that thing. You know what a child does to a guy like that?
Ignores all of those, by the way.
I'll tell you, there's a very different approach. The first time a father sees a little girl holding her arms up like this and saying, pick me up and hug me. And you're going, okay. This isn't as bad as I thought. There are changes in that.
Yes.
It tempers and moves a man in a different direction. And understand this, that aggression is those men are supposed to be leaders. If you don't give them an outlet for that, you prone them to violence because they will find a way to control. They will either find a way to lead or control. Which way do you want them to do?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
The only question I have about that is that then you end up finding people who have children or get married in order to be saved, and they expect that from their spouse or their children.
Absolutely, and we're going to talk about that. And there's the other problem. Paul's going to make it very clear. Marriage is not the solution unless the attitude that you carry into it is correct. Some people get married to solve their problems, and he's going to talk about that. Guess what? Marriage just brings a different set of problems. Does being single have problems? Absolutely, he says. Does marriage have problems? Absolutely, he's about to say. So hold on to that thought, because there's where you have to understand. We always look, again, here's the thing, same thing with the world. We just destroy it because we decide that's the quick solution. Or we find something we want to go after and think that's the quick solution. And again, anything we're going to do has to be done in a pattern after what God said, or it's not a solution. And that's what he's going to talk about here. Let's find the right opening, the right solution to solve this. So that first one, he talks about that. Marriage provides that kind of structure for a male. Now here's the other problem. Of course, they'll say this, well, marriage is horrible for women. And Paul's has talked about that. We looked at this in this whole thing. No, it's supposed to be the safest place for a woman to be. Marriage is supposed to teach men to view women as something other than an object, as something valuable, as something to be honored, cherished, and, I know this word is not popular in our culture, protected. The safest world for women is when men view women as something important and worth protecting and cherishing and taking care of. Anything you want to talk about? We talked about that whole law in Israel. They had this, that a woman could claim it was rape if she called out when the man tried to force himself on her. And you go, well, that seems like a weird rule, except for it comes down to this. What was the expectation of any decent man, godly man, when he heard a woman calling for help? You go help her. You don't just take out your cell phone and go, isn't that horrible? I'm gonna post it as soon as I get home. You're supposed to do something about it. Men trained to view this thing. Women are protected in this reality if men do that. Men see them as a partner in life, as something valuable and a contributor to their lives. It raises the level of women, not pushes them down, if marriage is what God said it's supposed to be. Marriage is seen as that. Is marriage better for children? Try this one. Guess what? A two-parent household, and I want to add this, a two-parent household with a man and a woman is the best structure for children to thrive. No matter how we try to do the studies, that is true. Why? Because children get to see relations between men and women in the way they're supposed to be, how a man treats a woman, how a woman treats a man. They get to see two sexual roles. Guess what? Children under godly marriages have far less structure problems and far less gender dysphoria as far as what it means to be male or female. Why is that so?
Because they see it from the parent.
They got to see it lived out in real life. And it turns out that affirming any moments of doubt and confusion they may have was not the best thing, but demonstrating to them how God intended it to work works better. It actually does. I would just add that they found this, that all this talk we're having about gender dysphoria and young children, if you let them process themselves through into adulthood, over 90% of them are comfortable with their birth identity and gender if you just let them go through the process of being a child.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what childhood is? It's that learning period when you're not sure about things.
Mm-hmm.
So again, giving structure to this is how it works. It was stability. It was stability financially. Here's the other thing that's a reality. What is the number one contributing factor to women who are in poverty and children in poverty? The lack of a husband and father in the home. These are simple realities. So Paul is saying we need to get back to this basic understanding that there needs to be a high view of marriage. And then on top of that, he said this. Here's the answer to your thing. You're talking about this hypersexuality in the world. What's your best defense against that? Remembering that God made sexuality to be part of the marriage relationship. And if you hold that in high level of value, if you treat it and keep it in that relationship, guess what? Your problem in a perverse world, your best solution is not to avoid marriage, it is marriage. A healthy, godly marriage. Now here's the question that comes up. If he's going to put all this, I mean, God went so far as to say marriage is the grace of life. Remember that? This is supposed to be the most blessed, the most fulfilling relationship you will have. That's what he intended. Is that always how it works? I'll say no, but that's what he intended. So you have to come back to this. Well, Paul, if all of that is true, if you're saying our best defense against this hypersexuality is a marriage, why did you ever say it's good for a man not to marry? What's that all about?
Can I ask a question about that? Because my scripture says it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. It doesn't say not to marry.
Okay, understand, in the biblical structure, where are sexual relations supposed
In a
to happen?
marriage.
In a marriage.
Okay.
So when Paul is talking about that, his natural understanding is, you're trying to get this right about sexuality. Where is sexuality supposed to happen? In a marriage. And he's now saying, yes, it is good. The literal translation would be, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. That is the best thing, that is actually the most accurate translation of that passage. It is good for a man not to touch a woman. And if you go back to the Old Testament, that touch woman refers to sexual activity, and it always is, it should only happen in marriage structure. So this is the dynamic equivalent I have in the NIV. Some of yours may have that, but it will say marriage, because that's clearly what he has in view there. So he comes back to this. Well, what is it? How is it then that being single makes any sense whatsoever? Why is that a good thing? Paul didn't answer that when he started, because his first thing was, let's make sure, one, we're not going to be divorcing to make life better. We're not going to be avoiding marriage to make life better. We're not going to say, but there are people that God has gifted with the ability to be single. Now, let me define that a little bit, and then we'll start our passage. This does not mean that God is only looking out and saying, you know what? We're starting things out, and Tim, I look at you, I think marriage. You're going to get married, and that's the way it's going to be. We're going to go over here, and I'm sorry, Michael.
Matthew, your toes.
Matthew, sorry, I got my apology as I was looking over here and I got my names mixed. So I'm just gonna hard to use him as an example with his wife sitting right next to him. God has decided that, this is it. You're never gonna get married. I really, this may be tough on you to deal with right at the moment, but that's the way it's gonna be. God has decided. You've got this special gift. Okay. There are some that actually do have that gifting from the start. But understand this. For some people, this gift is a temporary thing. There are some younger people that God says, you're going to get married later in life, but for now, I've set aside purpose for you, and you are going to have the gift of remaining single for a time. For a number of us, after life has gone on and we've been married and spouses have passed, and now you find yourself as a widow or a widower, perhaps you're in that situation where the wife was an unbeliever and she walked out on you. Later in life now, God says, guess what? Some of you will not feel the need for another relationship. That one was sufficient enough. That's where you at. I noticed, George, you didn't remarry. I'll tell you, I'm not going to be doing that myself. I can tell you that right now. I wouldn't want to be comparing any other relationship to the one I've had for 44 years. There are some things I'm just not likely to do. Some of us later in life will be in a position, if we're still here, where God says, you know what, you don't need another relationship, but you can serve God now as a single individual through time. The gift may come at any point in life. And Paul is going to cover some of this as he looks into this. With that understanding here, what are the benefits? Why does God say that some people should be single? Looking at verse 25, let's dig through this and get an answer. He starts here. Now about virgins. His first focus is people who have never been married. And he says, I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Now here's one of those phrases again. Remember how we dealt with this? Some people say, here's Paul saying, God never said anything about it. I'm going to give you my opinion. Is that what he's saying? No, he's not. He's saying Jesus didn't speak to this issue of being single. I can't quote Jesus to you on this, but when I speak, why am I speaking?
I'm speaking for him.
What's that?
I'm speaking for Jesus.
I'm speaking as God, because I'm one God has found trustworthy. Who were the people that God found trustworthy enough to give us scripture? Apostles, prophets in the Old Testament. He is saying, I have been given this authority. I am one found trustworthy. Which means that what I have to say carries the same weight. I know that you with the red letter editions may not believe this, but it carries the same weight as what Jesus said. That's what he's saying here. I have been found trustworthy, and I can speak to this issue. And let me tell you a little something about it. Who is by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. He says, because of the present crisis, I think that is a good thing for you to remain as you are. Now, I want you to understand, Paul is going to give not an opinion here, but an option, not a command. Do you understand the difference? Paul is saying, under the teaching of God, there is an option here, not a command, but an option that is available. And he says, especially for those of you who understand the present crisis. What is he talking about? What is the present crisis?
And what you've been talking about this whole time.
Sexual immorality.
Free for all.
The world is a mess. I think that may be part of it, but I think he's getting more specific here because this is an interesting word in the Greek. This word about crisis is often translated, frequently translated, as violence. You can find it in a number of Luke 21 has it 2 different times translated as violence. 2 Corinthians 6:4 translates it as violence. 2 Corinthians 12:10 translates it as violence. 1 Thessalonians 3:7 translates the word as violence. If it's violence, what's Paul talking about? What is he saying is this world is getting ready to do if it hasn't already started? Persecution. Understand, has Paul had a little persecution in his life too?
Yeah, a little bit.
Just a little bit here and there, maybe, well, we'll look into it, you might be right, might be wrong, who knows? Yeah, I think Paul has had some issues. And he is saying this, that in the present crisis, he's looking at this culture that is so hypersexualized, that is so wiped in a certain direction, and he's saying, you know what's going to come out of this? When you put our teaching as Christians against a world that wants to go there, what do you think is likely to happen in time?
Go there.
The world's going to get violent. I don't know if you've been watching, but this whole debate that's going on in our culture, there is one group that is targeted more than any other as being said that this group is a real problem for us in where we want to go as a culture. And you know who that group is? It is Christians. About 10 or so years after, maybe about 15 at the most, after Paul writes this letter, Nero comes into power in Rome. You know what Nero institutes? A full-blown persecution. Paul will die at the hands of Nero. Peter will die at the hands of Nero. A number of Christians, and we know Corinth will become a center point where a number of believers will die because of the persecutions coming. And here's what Paul is saying. You're not married right now. You get married, and 10 years out, where are you going to be? What's going to have happened likely in those 10 years?
Kids.
Children, different things, and then persecution hits. And he's going to say this. This may come as a shock to you, but it's a little easier for you as a single person to face persecution than it is when you see your spouse or your children face persecution. It was an interesting quote I had. I'm trying to find the author of it, but it said this. It is amazing how a brave man becomes a coward when his mind turns to his widowed wife and his orphaned children. It changes this, doesn't it? It's one thing to put yourself through this. Paul talks about going hungry, being a night and a day on the open sea. Would that have been a little harder if you had a wife and children traveling with him? I'm thinking so. So Paul's beginning point is, you know what? I'm not saying, I'm letting you know, God never said you had to stay single. We've covered that. But if you're not married and you believe that God has given you the gift, I'm going to tell you something. In the coming years, you're likely to suffer less than some other people will. It is likely that things are going to be a little easier for you. Because of the present crisis, I think it is good for you to remain as you are. Now here he goes. What does he say immediately? Are you married? Get a divorce. That's not what he said? What does he say? Do not seek a divorce. Are you unmarried? Do not look for a wife. He's going, okay, don't run back to where we started on this thing and think, well, I'm going to be super spiritual, and because I don't want to have my family go through this, tell you what, honey, I'm gone. We're going to get a divorce so that I can serve God without worrying about what happens to you. He's going, no, don't play that game. Let's not go back there. But if you're unmarried, it may be an option for you to think, don't look for a spouse. But again, if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I would spare you. Now here, there's a different word for troubles. The first word, we talk about difficulties, he talked about violence. This word is thlipsis in the Greek, and it talks about pressure. This word talks about, it was often used to describe the process of getting the juice out of grapes, where you would press it between two surfaces and crank the thing down and force it out and get the grapes out. He says there's going to be pressure if you get married. Now that's an interesting comment. Pressure. Why would he describe marriage as pressure? Now we're going to get to the thing you brought up. This is where Paul's going to talk about this. I want you to think about this. Do you think there's more issues when you have two sinners living together or less? I think there's probably more. When you have more than one person who can lead you astray, your odds go up. And I think he's talking about you're putting two people into the same household, and whether you want to think about this or not, I know when you're starry-eyed, you're in love, and all the world is a wonderful place, you don't think about this. But guess what? That beautiful young lady, that handsome, dashing man that you wanted to marry, and guess what? When you have to live with them day in and day out, you start to notice something. You know what you notice? They're not as perfect as I thought. There's pressure there. What kind of pressure comes to marriage that isn't there for a single person?
Just making a basic decision on something.
I think that's one thought. It is simpler. You were just going to buy a car. And you could decide, here's what I can afford, here's what I want to spend, and here's what I want to get. And you got to make all those decisions by yourself. Color, model, make, everything was entirely up to you. You know what I found out? That anytime a decision comes up, you invite me over. Hey, would you like to come over today? Hang out today? Well, you know what I have to say immediately? Let me check with my wife. I don't know if I can come out and play today. I might have to stay home. I'm not sure yet. I'll ask. Every decision.
Like, honey, you want to go out tonight? Sure. Where do you want to go? I don't know. Where do you want to go?
Back and forth it goes. What if you make up your mind? All of this stuff goes on. Every decision in life becomes more of an issue because you have to take that into account. You have to sort that stuff out. Vicki in the back over here.
When we were dating, Tim broke up with me so that he could have his freedom.
I wasn't quite ready yet.
That didn't last a whole lot of time there.
Seemed a little selfish.
He decided to come back later. But
Yeah, show me.
I think a problem is having to overcome your own struggles in a marriage for the sake of the marriage. Like, when you're on your own, you have yourself, and if you struggle with something, it's really only you that's affected by that.
Yeah.
But then you're in a marriage, and all of a sudden, your problems now affect the state of your relationship.
Yes.
And like how well you treat your partner, and then it's like you have to overcome these things in order to remain in a healthy relationship.
I'll tell you one of the most frustrating things I had, because I'm a demonstrative person when I'm upset. Somebody does something stupid, I want to let it out for a couple of minutes. Oh, I can't believe what that idiot said. What a jerk. And my wife's going, what do you get upset about? I'm not mad at you. I'm not mad at you. I'm not mad at you. I am now, but I wasn't when I started. She doesn't want the spillover. Because the guy I'm upset with, he's not hearing me say any of this. He's on the TV. You know who's getting it?
it's on a telly.
Yeah. Those crazy little moments where there's some things that I need a moment to let it out, but she takes that personally. And she should, because she's the only person listening to it.
So Tim would get upset at the TV with sports, and it wasn't very wise, but I used to ask him, so could you tell me that in light of eternity, how much does this matter? That didn't really help.
And there's the other problem that comes into this.
Gasoline that was.
The other person feeds the issue. We have found this. Who's the best expert in your life who can push the button to get you fired up about something? They know right where it is and how hard to push it, man. And it wasn't productive. And how many times do you say it after you discovered it wasn't productive?
Oh, not very many.
Not many. Yeah. All of these things are very real. And then not only that, you add more sinners to the mix because you have children and they have demands. And understand, the demands are real. You have to consider the impact it has on people. You have to put your schedule for other people around you. All of these things have to be planned. There's pressure in a marriage.
I'm relearning this whole thing when Clint and Bessie moved back in, because now they have 2 little kids running around, and I have a hard time going back to say, okay, now how did I train my kids up again? And then I'm the grandparent, not the father, so it's like am I able to say something and do something about it? So,
There's the tension. I'm not dad, but it is my house. I have to live with it, but they're not my kids. Yeah.
I mean, that's a tough road for me to hoe, so, I'm in that process.
We'll be praying for you.
It works, it does, but it's, yeah, you have to know when.
You know, what's really hard for a mom, especially if she's a young mom with young children, is that the husband feels left out, and yet you've got a crying baby, so who do you cater to? And it's just really, you know, that's a tough road.
It is. There are demands. Marriage carries a certain level of demands. And here's another one that comes into this, that really disturbs me with this, that you find people will say, I'm single, I'm not built to be single. Well, that may be true, and I want to get into this relationship, and you're coming with the expectation it's going to solve all my problems. It's going to make all the anxiety, the loneliness go away. I sadly will tell you this, some of the loneliest people I've ever met are married people.
Amen to that.
There's nothing more lonely than being in another house with a person and you found you share nothing with anymore, and there's this distance between you. That is the loneliest moment in the world. And I've seen some of the saddest people imaginable in that circumstance. It is tragic. And I run into this again and again, this rushing into it to assume that it's going to solve your problems. And you'll talk to them, and I'm counseling, it's a couple going back and forth, and one or the other, frequently the wife, more often than not, I just can't believe he does this, this, and this. And you go, was he doing that when you dated? Yes.
I loved him for it.
Yes, he was.
He was so cute.
And then you ask, why then did you jump into this relationship? And you know what invariably they say? I thought he would change. Okay, my next question comes to this. Was he actively working with you, talking with you, praying with you to make changes in these areas before you got married?
No.
In fact, did you ever bring it up to him?
No,
Most often not.
definitely not, no.
And vice versa.
And it goes the other way as well.
Yeah.
Understand, again, Paul's high view of marriage is marriage done the way God intended it to be. Paul is not offering marriage as a cure-all. He's offering godliness as a cure-all and saying that if you do these things the way God intended, it will be better, but it may not be if it isn't done that way. And he's saying this, there are expectations. There just are. There are pressures. Now, don't get me wrong here. You could not pay me enough to go back to being single. This has been the grace of life for me. I will not say anything other than that. It has been the greatest relationship I've ever had, the greatest change in life. God gave me the best gift I've ever had. But with that said, did it change things? Yes, there have been difficulties, there have been challenges, the reality has been there. And it compounds with every aspect. Like I said, one person, now you have 2 sinners together. You have children, now you have 5, 6, 7 sinners together. And then you get that the worst of all worlds, extended family.
In-laws.
In-laws. In-laws who are just want to pick at everything that goes on. I'll tell you, for years, Cherie's entire family hated my guts. They thought that was the biggest mistake she ever made in life.
Wow.
They absolutely did. Her brother tried to talk her out of the marriage on the day of our wedding.
Wow.
Are you sure you want to go with it? You ought to think this through. It wasn't till years later that I got to finally prove I wasn't nearly as bad as they thought.
Oh.
It takes a while, and there's keep pressures, and people just always want to pick in. Marriage brings issues to life. It just does. And Paul is making that plain. I'd spare you that if I could. What I mean, brothers, he says, and here's going to put something, that the time is short. From now on, those who had wives should live as if they had none. Those who mourn as if they did not. Those who are as happy as if they were not. Those who buy something as if it was not theirs to keep. Those who use the things of this world as if were not engrossed in them. For the world in its present form is passing away. Now that's a really odd little insert in there, isn't it? Now what does he possibly mean? Now, I can see some guys would look at this saying, to act as I'm married as if I'm not married, well, this is a great idea. Is that what he's saying? Just pretend the relationship doesn't exist? No, we know that can't be it. He's already said we have to have a high view of marriage. The husband and wife should fulfill their duty to one another. You don't treat this as if it doesn't exist. You've got commitments. So what does he possibly mean by inserting this in here? As mourn if you weren't mourning, to act as if you weren't happy? What's he talking about?
Well, could it be that since Christ rose from the dead, we're coming closer to the end times?
He is definitely talking about that. We're moving toward the end times. And here's something he wants you to understand. Everything in this life is temporary.
Yeah.
All of it is temporary. And guess what? So is marriage. Marriage is for this life.
Yeah.
Jesus has told us there will be no marriage or giving of marriage in heaven. Now, I admit, I don't understand how that works. I really can't conceive of an existence where my wife is not the closest person to me. I honestly don't see how that works. God doesn't explain how that's going to be. I have closer friends and lesser friends among Christians. How does that work when we move into a reality where we love perfectly? Are there still closer people to us? I don't know. I would tend to think so, but I don't know. But here's Paul's point. Anything that you put ahead of the pursuit of what God told you to pursue becomes an impediment. And that can include marriage. When you make marriage the epitome, this is the thing that solves this is what I'm all about. I am just focused here. You've got a problem. You cannot make anything more important than service to God. You can't. I've had couples talking about, we're going to get close to retirement now. We're just going to travel. We're going to do this. Well, that's great. I'm glad you're going to have the time to do that. But I'll have to ask you this. What are your plans for each other in terms of service to God? What are you planning to do there? While you're gallivanting, what are you going to do to serve God? Yes.
I heard a young woman at our church give her testimony that she kind of idolized her husband, and because he had a close relationship with God, he had to teach her how to steer her affections to God as being number one. She said it was the hardest thing for her to do and to learn, but she is so thankful to him now because their relationship is stronger and her source for everything isn't him, it's God. Which is awesome that he did that for her. That was a gift.
We can really push the relationship and idolize it in ways that are unhealthy.
Yes.
And did God give us a partner to enrich us, to make us better people? Absolutely. That's what he's talking about. I'll put this out. I've often wondered how I'm going to cope with that with God if my wife goes first. Because again, the tumultuous nature of my growing up and so forth, I tended to be prone toward violence, and I had issues that she has moderated in life for me. I wonder, without that governing influence, without that moderation, will that other side of me reemerge? And God is saying, she wasn't the solution, I was the solution. She was the agent, she's the means by which I put that solution in your life. But if she's gone, I'm not.
Right.
Don't forget where this started, Myron. We have to have that understanding.
Yes.
That God is ultimately the source of all these things.
Which is totally beautiful.
And we have to have that focus. And Paul is trying to remind us of that. Don't let anything get in the way of that focus. Even marriage can become an idol if we're not careful.
Yeah.
It can.
Well, praise God for Cherie.
There you go. I do every day. But this world in its present form is passing away. Paul is going, every day moves us closer to the end of time. God is moving us in that direction. And again, he's talking about this whole focus, because isn't that where we live? The whole center of sin is that we put all of life here in what we get now. I mean, even if this whole gender identity thing, all of our sin really comes down to this. I want to find a way for me to be self-actualized, for me to achieve my ultimate happiness, for me to become whatever I want to be, for me to be, and it's all about me and my happiness, my fulfillment, even to the point now that we think that somehow our happiness and fulfillment has to be letting children decide at ages 4 and 5 what their gender identity is. All of this comes out of an idea that says, this life is where I'm going to find all my fulfillment, all my happiness, all my identity. And Paul is saying, wait a minute. It isn't this world, because this world is temporary. Don't focus here. Don't make it all about what happens here. That's the distinction he's trying to make. Then he says this, I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, but also not concerned about the Lord's affairs, not only about the Lord's affairs, but how can he please his wife? But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world. I got it mixed up here. I'm sorry. How can he please the Lord? But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world. How can he please his wife? So he says a single guy is more likely to be singularly focused. He can ask, what do I do to serve God? But a married man has to ask, not only how do I serve God, but how do I serve my wife? Now, is Paul presenting that as an evil thing? No. As a matter of fact, what does Scripture tell us? We're supposed to be focused as married people. Our spouse. He defines love as acts of service. So we're supposed to look for things that serve our spouse. That's supposed to be. But he is saying, again, it is more complicated, isn't it? There are things that go on. Again, we come back to that. You got to pick up the kids. You got to go do this. Isn't it a little simpler for a single man to? I listened to one of the missionaries we had, and I want to go into the mission field. So I'm going to go home, and right now I'm quitting my job. I'm selling the house. I'm buying tickets, and I'm on my way. You can do it. It may not be the smartest thing. You probably should talk about that. Get to make sure you have the training, see if you're actually called to the field. But if you wanted to be that impulsive, there you go. Is it a little different if you're married?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Just a little?
A lot.
It might be a lot different. What do you mean you sold the house, honey? No? We're going where? And Paul is saying, the decisions he's made, Paul has been able to just say, you know what? I'm going to Rome. I'm planning to go to Spain. And he can make those plans between him and God. Now, I love it with Paul, because if you notice Paul, all through the book of Acts, Paul says, I'm going to do this, this, and this. Does Paul always do this, this, and this?
No. In fact, God tells him no. So
God tells him no. I tried 3 times to get it, and God wouldn't let me go.
And if you had a wife, I would have had somebody to tell you.
Somebody go. Yeah, that's right. I told you God didn't want you going there.
Could be God and his wife.
So again, God had directed that the beauty being as we plan and God directs our steps. Paul had to be curtailed. His enthusiasm sometimes got ahead of him. But again, when you're married, you have to look at certain kinds of things. You have to step back from those kinds of things. And as a matter of fact, I'll tell you this, I think some of the worst pastors I've ever seen are the ones who forget that. I've been shocked by the number of men, they travel all over the country speaking here, doing that, they're involved in the ministry, every ministry of the church, everything, every time the doors are open, they're there. And you look at what happens to their families. And it's embarrassing what occurs there. It's not how it's supposed to be. I'll tell you this, and this is personal, you can agree with this. I refuse to support any missionary with funds who, 1, leaves his wife at home while he goes, or 2, farms his children out for someone else to raise while he and his wife go. Because I don't see that pattern in Scripture that says, I absolve myself of my responsibility to wife and children because I'm serving the Lord.
Right.
It's not in the book. And I have a real problem with the attitude that shows in those things. I think we know this. Why do we give our pastor here vacation time? Because we know he needs a break from this, and we know he needs to spend time with his family.
What?
We recognize if we want to have a quality pastor for any length of time, it's probably a good idea to support the fact that he needs to be focused on them. Take some pressure off of him. Make some things happen to that. That's the simple reality. But it says here, how can he please his wife? He has to ask that question. It's not, of course you have to ask that question. And his interests are divided, but an unmarried man or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Does that mean that a married man is not concerned about the Lord's affairs? No. He's saying that it can be a little more focused in one area. Now I want to pause here for a moment. Because some people read this and say, well, obviously now, what Paul is saying, the biggest benefit of being single is because only super Christians can be single. This is the tack the Catholic Church took. You will have a vow of celibacy, you will be only focused on the Lord's things, so they're nuns, they're priests, they're monks, all of these people never get married. And that's how they decided it goes.
That worked out well.
That has not worked out well. I also find it interesting that when God says, here's what I want in a leader, he has some very specific things. And one of the first things he says for both elders and deacons is it has to be the husband of one wife. Well, if it's easier to serve God and not be married, why is it that when you say you want me to find a good leader in the church, that you want me to find a guy that's a husband of one wife? Now let me stop on that one. You know what the words husband of one wife means?
One woman man.
It means a one-woman man. It does not mean he has avoided divorce court. Their marriage sucks, but he avoided divorce court, and that's all we're concerned about. What is a one-woman man?
Dedication.
What's that?
Dedication.
He's dedicated. This woman is obviously the only woman in his life where he sees in this way. Not only that, he actually loves, respects, and cares for her. He has a good marriage. That is supposed to be what we look for. Not just, did he avoid being divorced?
Yeah.
Bill and Hillary Clinton avoided being divorced. I do not think I want anyone to look at that marriage as a model of how God wants a marriage to run. And that's not a political statement, that's just looking at their relationship, guys. You can think he's the greatest president ever, but I'll have to say, clearly not the greatest husband.
Yeah.
Well, and if that leader's gonna care for the church, then you're looking for how he cares.
And where do you see it better than any place else?
At home.
Also, I think there's this. A leader isn't just the one that teaches a great lesson and does a lot of activities. He also has to be someone who sets an example in life that the rest of us can follow. And if that example is not there, the sermons and the other things are empty. There's a reality to this. This is how it works. Okay. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world. How can she please her husband? I'm saying this for your own good, not to restrict you. Notice how he says that? Don't take this as me saying I want you to avoid marriage and saying marriage is bad. I'm letting you know that there are some benefits of being single. There is a little more freedom, and if God has called you to that, this is a good thing. It can be a good thing. I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord. Now we're running out of time here, so let me roll real fast. If anyone thinks he is acting improperly toward a virgin he's engaged to, and if she is getting along in years, and he feels he ought to marry, he should do as he wants. He is not sinning. They should get married. Wow. Now why does he do this? Because, but the man who has settled the matter in his own mind, who is under no compulsion, but he has control over his own will, and who has made up his mind not to marry the virgin, this man also does the right thing. So then he who marries the virgin does right, and he who does not marry the virgin does right. Now that sounds weird, but here's what Paul is coming back to again. Remember this attitude, we're going to make up this rule that says, I'm going to decide to avoid relationships so I can serve God. And he's saying this, I'm not only talking to you married people. You are some guy, you've been dating this girl now for 2 years. She has gotten the idea, you're the only single guy in the room I'm signing in. And she's gotten the idea you're interested in marriage. And now you're all of a sudden going to go, well, you know, I've decided to be super spiritual. Honey, I know that you had thoughts and we talked about a future together, but I am now going to be a spiritual man and follow God. And he's saying, don't play games with people's lives. See, it's not just marriage, but when you have invested and given someone an impression that this is the interest and this is what, understand, in Scripture, dating isn't about having a fun time with your friends. It's about preparing for a future. Sorry, I know you guys have to be for the next service. But you see, you can't do that. And don't use this idea that it's super spiritual to excuse yourself for abusing someone. If you were looking into that relationship, you need to ask yourself, why was I saying that if I thought God called me to be single? So know where you stand. Get it right and do it right and treat people right. But now he says this, a woman is bound to her husband for as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, but she must belong to the Lord. It is my judgment she is happier if she stays as she is, and I think I have the Spirit of God. We'll end on this, and I had some more to say about that, but I've run long and I apologize. He comes to this final conclusion and says this, you know what? You can make this choice either way, and God will honor it. That's how it goes. As long as you have looked into your life and you prayed before God and said, this is my calling, make the decision and stand by it. Understand it? Don't be ashamed of it. And he's saying this. There comes a time when you might choose to be single. And Paul now says, and I think I have the Lord's mind on this. I think he's being a little sarcastic here because Paul is saying something. You guys think you're so smart with your ideas, you dismiss what I've tried to teach you, but I'm just letting you know I've got a little experience in this category. And we go back to this, as I told you before, Paul, we believe, was probably married at some point in his life. It was required to be a member of the Sanhedrin. Paul was probably married. And later now, we guess now, when Paul starts talking about when a wife dies, a man has a moment to make a decision. Is Paul saying, I've been there. You think I don't have the experience to make this kind of a statement? You think I don't know what I'm talking about? It's now my point in life. I could remarry if I wanted to. But I'm saying God has put me in a position where I've looked at life and said, you know what? I'm going to finish out life by myself, and I'm okay with that. I'm ready to face that. I'm ready to do that. And I may have a little experience in this category that's worth listening to. Maybe I'm not as dumb as some of my critics there say I am. Maybe I'm not as far off as some of the people have been trying to say, the Judaizers, the people who always try to discredit me. Maybe I've got some insight here that actually makes sense, and I know what I'm talking about. Just maybe I've got this right. We'll close this out. We just have a few brief moments, and I apologize. I wanted to get through that section.